Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the privilege of being with you. And I will offer you a personal salute and a kind of a remembrance, maybe, rather than a scientific review of all that's transpired in the Human Genome Program. I think it's a glorious achievement, and Genbank represents kind of a reflection of that achievement, so I'm very proud of it. I'll give you a rather NLM-centric view of the world, but you kind of expected that, I imagine. The actual inspiration for Genbank occurred quite a long time ago. That was it. Now watch the electricity go between those two fingers, because that was the magic. From my point of view, the field took a major turn when Delbecco's letter to the editor of Science appeared, and he strongly got behind the concept of the Human Genome Project. I'll quote a little bit from him. He said, "An effort of this kind could not be undertaken by any single group. It would have to be a national effort." It's turned out that way. Its significance would be comparable to that of the effort that led to the conquest of space. I think that's probably true too. And it should be carried out with the same spirit. Even more appealing would be to make it an international undertaking. That's turned out that way because the sequence of human DNA is the reality of our species. So the spark took a little bit longer to get to Bethesda. I came in '84, this was a swearing in, and I immediately started us on the direction of a long-range plan, and one of the most important parts of the 5 panels, the most important of the 5 panels in some respect, was Panel 3 on obtaining factual information from databases. It was a distinguished bunch, as you'll see from these names. Bob Kahn is still with us, Josh Lindberg we've lost. Rich Roberts happily has supported and been a tremendous help to Genbank ever since. Jerry Peel is dead. Dan Macy's was there because he was representing NCI, but luckily we hired him quickly. Well, I don't know, anyway, I'm glad they sent him. Maybe they're not, but. And Alan Maxim was an assistant professor of biochem, I think, at Harvard, and he did a critical thing. Standing outside the boardroom, as I recall it, puffing pipes, which I guess we wouldn't do today. I remember asking him what he thought about these sequences and what should happen to them. I mean, I was on the Stanford President's Advisory Committee, so there was much talk about him, but I wasn't sure that the group understood him or I fully understood him. And Alan said, well, do you want molecular biology 101 for med students? I said, sure. So we went back in and spent 20 minutes. He literally got chalk on his coat sleeves, went to the blackboard and started out with chromosomes and what's on them. And at the end of the presentation, I mean, even taking into account that there were very savvy people in that room, there was a kind of a silence. And we agreed that, you know, this is a library problem. Somebody's got to straighten up that mess. And so they made a recommendation that genetic and biochemical data is accumulating faster than can be assembled. You can read it as fast as I. And that we got to do something about it. Essentially, they agreed it is a library problem, and it should be run by somebody with a public mandate. NLM has that. Get busy and do it. And include the international research community. So it required that this be said in a non-science, well, in a way that was understandable by the public and the Congress, not just the scientists. And we actually hired a writer, thank God we did, who put together a simple piece of prose called Talking One Genetic Language. And that helped. And that was put in the hands by request of Senator Pepper, and he introduced a bill in the House to create a National Center for Biotechnology Information. We're rather keen at NLM on authority, on authorization, I should say. And this would create that authorization. The bill didn't get acted on, and the bill in the Senate was delayed. And delayed, you know, means somebody has gotten in the way. But nonetheless, that year, the Appropriations Committee did provide specifically $3.85 million additional within the List of Hill budget so that we could get going on that project and start planning for such a center. I remember talking to Mr. Pepper about this problem, and he responded as follows. He said, "Doctor, don't worry. I will introduce the bill in the House. Mr. Kennedy will introduce the bill in the Senate, and the bill will pass. And so it did. And Mr. Kennedy included Childs and Domenici and a number of others in the sponsorship. There followed then the spring of '86, which was for us the kind of like springtime for Hitler, if you remember the funny play on Broadway. But there was a DOE workshop, very well done in the human genome, which essentially announced, forget about the argument, we'll just do it. And that left us kind of in the cold. There was an NLM executive committee which explored the Biotechnology Center and the draft of the plan I just showed you, and we try to make our plans. This was followed in the fall by a meeting of the NIH Directors Advisory Committee, which looked at NIH's options. And the pronouncement from NIGMS was, I quote, "Of course, you wouldn't want librarians to be in charge of gene sequences." But in fact, we did want that. And Dan Macy's was dispatched forthwith to Los Alamos. Work began, of course, in Lister Hill itself, but it turned out that the Genbank keywords were essentially almost 100% analogous and comparable to the mesh terms, so that if you search the literature, the Medline searches, you found 97% of all the sequences that were already assembled, and hundreds that you would miss if you did it in the other fashion. So there was a software hanging around then already called IRX, Information Retrieval Experimental System, a very good system. And it was possible to search all the sequences that then existed, plus this protein ID resource, plus online Mendelian inheritance of man. Now, all these are smaller than they subsequently became, but as a proof of concept, I thought it could be shown that the librarians didn't do too damn badly. So Mr. Pepper held hearings on this topic, and it was supported by testimony from Don Fredrickson, from Victor McCusick, from Rich Roberts, from Jim Weingarten, and myself. And it was rather fun, because actually the star of those hearings is this young man to the right. And we had gotten his name and permission to invite him from NIH Clinical. He was suffering from pituitary dwarfism. And so we're telling the story that recombinant DNA processes were allowing us to fabricate growth hormone, which essentially saved him from being called runt and mutt and so forth. He told all those stories. And getting to be, I was a little afraid that we were going to have something grotesque to show on TV, but as you can see, he's a handsome young guy. He was 17, he was playing soccer, made a beautiful presentation. And Pepper, of course, loved cross-examining him. So out of that came a very fine report, Unlocking the Mysteries of Disease, a Pepper phrase. And he got behind the program 100%, expressing his belief that sequencing human genome will unlock secrets, which will help in our efforts to fight many diseases against which we are now relatively defenseless. Somebody has to say that stuff. And if we scientists don't find it natural, we better find someone who does find it natural. Now, in NLM tradition, of course, there was time for a party. And in the center is Jack Whitehead, who was then chairman and president and owner and whatnot of a corporation and chairman of the board of Friends, and Mr. Pepper and Dr. Weingarten. And it was a very pleasant event, and Dr. Weingarten, I have to say, was tremendously helpful and supportive of both of the Human Genome Project and of NCBI and of the Genbank idea. He really loved it. In fact, he told me personally that he stayed an extra year at NIH in order to recruit Jim Watson to come and take on that program. So the papers said, well, Senate passes a genome bill. That was the bottom line. That's the bill. That bill actually, as it turned out, also created the Deafness Institute. And we rejoiced that the president signed the bill. And what did it do? Well, it authorized NCBI and, of course, created it, and it authorized $8 million a year. Not appropriated, authorized, and that was good. The critical moment was issuing 12 FTEs by NIH, Office of the Director, and that was Ed Rall. And I remember vividly his telephoning me and saying, "Okay, Don, I'll give you 12, and don't you use one of them on a damned administrator." I said, "Guarantee, Ed." So they were to be used by David Littman and appropriated to scientists, and we were to provide the administrative backup and purchasing and personnel and those kind of things. And that's, I don't think if we'd asked him for, gosh, what have you got now, David, 400, something like that? More than that, yeah. Well, if we'd asked Ed for the number you've got now, he would have thrown me out in my ear. Now, this is a lousy picture. He's a good-looking guy, but this is the only one I could find out on internet. So anyway, in '89, he got recruited from NIDDK, mathematics section, to NCBI, and it was a very happy day for me, I hope for him and for the field. A little bit of what was it really like then. Christian Birks, who is here happily, was quoted a couple of years ago, and I think the 20th anniversary, as saying as soon as there was this public database, people expect the data to be there, but it would take a year for the data to show up. And actually, in fact, he pointed out that 2 years into the project, Genbank was backlogged 18 months. I mean, it was, so I'm saying it was tough, actually, to do that stuff. This is a composite picture. I don't know if I think I have, see if I have a little thing to point with. Yeah. Okay, so this is a sequence, and then I wanted to show you, this is what they're actually keyboarding from. I mean, that's a monumental task. Now, if anybody here, if you're interested in coins, you know, gold and silver coins, you know, one of the things people who do that look for is what mint did it come from. So you'll find a D for Denver or a P for Philadelphia. So if you look up here, that's an L for Lannel. So that's a collectible sequence right there. I'll show you an excerpt from a training manual created at NLM by David's people. But it just emphasizes how terribly difficult all this is to keystroke. You're getting the, if I'm looking correctly, the nucleotide sequences and then the protein transcriptions. And in order to get it right, knowledgeable people had to go over this ahead of time. So there's a little note here, type CGC after TTT and before TGC for sequence of a certain number. So I mean, and there's the little arrow that says that's what you do. Here you're a keyboard person, that's what you do. So this was tough stuff. And you could easily imagine, at least I can imagine, somebody at a keyboard saying to themselves, good God, 3 billion of these? Never going to get the end of it. But of course, the technology resulted in automation and funding of centers and so forth, and that improved that technical problem. So the final transition, as Michael said, was to live through these contracts that had been given out initially to Bolperanic and Newman, and then IntelliGenetics. And they finally dribbled to an end in October of '92, and Genbank was then totally transferred into David's hands. And in a way, you could say the rest is history. Could have shown plots of how fast the sequences improved or increased and the connections that were made. But I think actually history, science history, may remember Genbank in a way, in a different way, because to me that's the beginning, turning point. People now say a tipping point, but it was when the tradition of public science pooling the results in a public fashion so smart people all over the world could interpret them and make the discoveries. That really started with Genbank. And we have to salute I mean, time doesn't permit me to salute the great of the world, including Jim Watson, but he did insist that that was going to happen. Victor McCusick and Hugo people endorsed it, and the idea that all of the sequences in that project would go in right away, freely available to everybody in the world, really started something that we've never had before, and I hope we'll never do without. So I think that Genbank will go down in history as a turning point in access to science information, and I salute all of you who are responsible for this having happened. Thank you.